so he could figure out the American.
Ramsar Records' David Childers reteams with producer Don Dixon for Run, Skeleton, Run, coming May 5th. The lauded North Carolina singer-songwriter's latest effort features vocals and banjo contributions by Scott Avett of the Avett Brothers. Childers is a resident of Mount Holly, North Carolina. He's a former high school football player with the aw shucks demeanor of a good old Southern boy. Get your copy of David Childers' Run, Skeleton, Run on May 5th at RamsarRecords.com.
I'm Ben Sawyer.
And I'm not Bob Crawford.
But you are Ian Scotta, and this is The Road to Now. Ian is with me because we just came back from a road trip down to Columbia, Tennessee, where we visited the home of James K. Polk and talked about his presidency. Polk is the president who was elected, the 11th president was elected in 1844, served from 45 to 49.
Who elected him?
Who elected him? The Electoral College did.
This is
As
right.
all presidents are elected.
So I hear. So
you hear. Ian's joking because I gave him my Constitution quiz that I gave in my class one time, and I think the only one he missed was who elects the president. He wrote the people. Anyway, back to the focus of this. James K. Polk, 11th president of the United States, 45 to 49. Polk oversaw the annexation of Oregon, the Oregon Territory. He saw the annexation of Texas, which led to a war most likely provoked by the Americans, under Polk. A president who, nevertheless, we don't tend to learn a lot about because he's bookended by two pretty big presidents, by Jackson and by Lincoln. So today we spoke about that. We went to the home. It's in Columbia, Tennessee. If anyone is interested in historical sites, this is amazing. And the interview you're going to hear today is with Tom Price, who is curator at the museum and is a remarkable guy. And we hope that by the end of this interview, you'll understand the importance of Polk. So without further ado, here's Bob and I's interview with Tom Price at the Polk House.
Tom Price, welcome to The Road to Now.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
When you're interviewing a historian and they have more than one media availability in one day, you know something's going on. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on today at the Polk House?
Yeah, there's a big project that we've been working on for several months now that to people on the outside, I think the reaction is an interesting one, eyebrows raised for sure, and we're looking into the feasibility of moving the tomb of President and Mrs. Polk from the Capitol grounds in Nashville to the main historic site for the 11th president in Columbia. I think we have a very strong historical argument to make. And it really goes back to what we believe Polk's intent was based on his last will and testament. That James K. Polk, if you know anything about Polk, he was sort of a man with a plan, really through his whole life. He sort of worked with blinders on, and he was a very goal-oriented character. You get glimpses of it from the time that he was in college all the way through the rest of his life. He kind of went at everything head first. And when he was elected president in 1844. He was the youngest president up to the time. He was 49 years old, the first to be elected under the age of 50. And he said he was going to run for a single term only and then retire. So he knew he was going to retire at age 53. And so he made his plan. He was really looking forward to a potentially long retirement. What he called in his diary, when he would retire, he was going to cease to be the servant and become the sovereign, which is a great line. And so he wrote his will about 2 months before he left office and kind of surprised his wife. He went into her chamber and said, I've written this will, I want you to look at it. And she was kind of taken aback. And during their presidency, they bought a home in downtown Nashville. Now, up until this time, they had lived really their entire life in Columbia, Tennessee, about 50 miles south of Nashville. Kind of interesting, Polk's very first day off as president was a day trip to Mount Vernon. He wanted to see Washington's tomb, which had been designed by William Strickland, and sort of get a sense of the legacy of the first president, really thinking about his own legacy. So in 1849, he wrote his will, and in it he said they were going to move to Polk Place, one of the finest homes in downtown Nashville. And he said in his will that should he die first, his wife would get life estate of the property. She would get to live there for the rest of her life, but the ownership of the property would actually go to the state of Tennessee. And that he wanted to be buried under a tomb in the side yard of Polk Place. He died 3 months later. He's the youngest president to die. Outside of those who have been assassinated, he's the president to have the shortest retirement of all. So sort of a series of tragedies right off the bat. So he dies 3 months after he leaves the White House of cholera. Cholera was raging throughout the South at this point in time. And so he was buried the day after he died, as per a Nashville city ordinance that said if you died of any contagious disease, you had to be buried on the outskirts of town. So he was buried in city cemetery, and 11 months later, exhumed and moved to a tomb designed by William Strickland. The same guy that had designed Washington's tomb happened to be in Nashville in 1849, building the Tennessee state capitol. And so Strickland took the opportunity to create another presidential tomb, which he did. And Polk was buried in the side yard of Polk Place, exactly as he wanted in his will. He wanted to be buried in the side yard of Polk Place, like Washington at Mount Vernon, like Jackson at the Hermitage. And then he went on to write in his will that when Sarah died, she would join him in the tomb, and then the state of Tennessee, through the office of the governor, would designate a worthy Polk family member to live in the property. So what is he doing? He's kind of setting up his historic site, right? This is the place, just like Mount Vernon, where his legacy was to reside. He wanted to be buried in the side yard. A family member would live in Polk Place. They would maintain it. They would pay the taxes on it. The state would own it. And presumably this family member would open the doors to whomever wanted to come and see and learn about the legacy of the 11th president. Well, the Polks had no children. There were no direct descendants of James K. Polk, and he didn't name anybody specifically. It was the governor's job to choose who that person would be. Another tragedy. 55 family members come forward, all sort of equally related to him, nephews and nieces and cousins, led by a nephew who was a lawyer in North Carolina and actually wasn't born until about a dozen years after Polk's death. And he sort of led this charge of 55 family members suing Polk's estate, saying that James K. Polk broke the laws of perpetuity, that a deceased person can't actually say what's going to happen in the future of a house. After a court fight, the family won. The judge told them to sell the property and split the proceeds 55 ways. They did it, and they had it down to a science. Some of them only got 1/756 of the sale price of $26,500. It's just a huge tragedy.
What year was this?
This is in 1893. Sarah died in 1891. She outlived her husband by 42 years. She's the longest widowed first lady in American history. So, and then immediately the family, these 55 Polk family members step in. 1893, the deal is sealed. They sell it outside of the family. And so on the other side of that court case, interestingly, is Sarah Polk's niece. Now, a year after James K. Polk died, Sarah adopted a 2-year-old orphan great niece and raised her as her own daughter. And she's on the opposite side of this court case. Her lawyer is the governor of Tennessee. And so after Polk Place was sold outside of the family, she determined that the tomb needed to be moved. If the property wasn't going to be a Polk property anymore, the tomb needed to go somewhere else. And the governor offered the Capitol grounds in Nashville as a sort of the next best fitting place for him at the time. Now, this is 1893. There's no historic site to the 11th president. And in 1901, Polk Place was torn down. The place where he hoped his legacy would reside is gone. So there's nothing left except this great niece, who is the heir to the contents of Polk Place. And so she displayed all of the Polk stuff in her house, which she had to move to after Polk Place was torn down. And when that got too burdensome, she moved it to the War Memorial Building in Nashville. And when that deal fell through, she started an organization called the James K. Polk Memorial Association in 1924, whose sole purpose is to interpret the life of the 11th President of the United States. In 1929, she bought the home in Columbia with the help of the state of Tennessee as the place where people would come to learn about the life of President Polk. Since 1929, the site in Columbia here is the place where Polk's legacy has resided. So our historical argument is, if you're looking back at Polk's will, he wanted to be buried where that legacy would be. This has been that since 1929.
Is this where we are sitting right now?
Exactly right.
Brilliant.
And so, Tom, who's on the other side of the argument?
So we've had a little pushback, which we expected we would get. This is a historic event, right? This has only been done one other time. James Monroe was moved from New York City to Hollywood Cemetery in the 1850s. Outside of that, this is the only time that a president has been moved. So there is a little pushback. A lot of people will make the argument that the Polks have been buried on the Capitol grounds for over 100 years. Why move them now? I guess from our perspective, and I'll mention too, and this is a key component to this. This really started as a grassroots effort. This didn't start with our organization. This came from visitors who came here and who are always absolutely amazed at James K. Polk. They didn't probably learn about him in school. They can identify him as a president, but they don't realize all that he managed to accomplish in his presidency. And they're always surprised. And invariably, the next question that comes out is, why doesn't he have his own version of Mount Vernon? Why doesn't he have a hermitage? Right. And of course, our response is, he did. He did for quite a long time, from 1849 at his death until the 1890s, he did have that. And then sadly, through this series of tragedies, that house was lost. So I don't really buy that. They've been buried over there for over 100 years. History is infinite, right? I think his argument still stands.
And to be fair, he's already been moved twice.
Right. So he's been buried 3 times, first in City Cemetery, then next at Polk Place, and then at the Capitol grounds.
And what stands where the Polk House was in Nashville now?
It was a whole city block, 7th and Union in downtown Nashville. The Capitol Grill stands there now. So when the house was sold outside of the family, it was sold to a man named Jacob McGavick Dickinson, kind of a high-powered lawyer in Nashville. He had no use for the house. He was Felix Grundy's grandson. Grundy originally built the house in about 1818. Polk updated it, changed the name to Polk Place. But when it sold outside of the Polk family, this guy, Jacob McGavick Dickinson, bought the house. But he had just been made chief counsel to one of the railroad companies in Kentucky. He had no use for the house. He let a cousin live there for about 1.5 years and left it abandoned after that. And then he sold it to a developer out of New York City who saw the commercial possibilities of a whole city block in downtown Nashville. And they tore it down and built a apartment. There's been a hotel on the property of one sort or another ever since.
So anyone who's listening right now in Nashville who's complaining that all these people are coming in and tearing down houses and the land's being developed by developers, you should know this is not a new thing. It happened to former presidents too. Huh?
Absolutely, yeah.
So you say that when people come here to this site, they don't recognize what it is that, they never realized how accomplished Polk was as a president. He's a one-term president. He's a guy who's kind of in between Jackson and Lincoln, these two great figures. Could you explain what is it about Polk? What did he accomplish, and why should he be remembered, as one of the most effective presidents?
Yeah, it's almost difficult to distill it down because there's so much. So you mentioned he was a one-term president, which, at first blush, people say, he must have lost re-election. He didn't. He was a promised one-term president. He said he was going to run for one term only and then step down. And then when he did that, when he said he would accept the nomination in 1844, he put forward these huge goals that he wanted to accomplish in a promised single term. It included bringing California in as a territory, settling the boundary of the United States in the Pacific Northwest, what was then considered or called Oregon Territory, stretched from what is now the southern boundary of the state of Oregon all the way up to the southern tip of Alaska. It was under joint occupation with Great Britain. There was no line of demarcation where the United States ended and British Canada began. He wanted to create the independent treasury system, which he managed to do as well. That became the basis for the American economy all the way till the coming of the Fed in 1912. And so he had these huge goals that he wanted to get done, and he managed to do it by this Herculean work ethic he had really throughout his life. If you read his diary, which is fascinating, if you're looking for little anecdotes about life in Washington, you're not going to find him. You're going to find this no-nonsense guy who worked these incredible hours. I looked through his diary, sort of added him up, 27 vacation days during his entire 4 years. So he's this workaholic guy who had very set goals and managed to accomplish them. Now, those are his big things. Here are the lesser things that he rarely gets credit for. He started the Smithsonian Institution during his presidency. He laid the cornerstone of the Washington Monument, July 4th, 1848. So you can't take a step in Washington without seeing the effects of the 11th president. The modern postal system, prior to Polk, you didn't pay to send a letter, you paid to receive it. Well, there's an inherent problem with that. If you're going to get mail you didn't want, you certainly weren't going to pay for it. So all of these unwanted letters went to the dead letter department, this bureaucracy within a bureaucracy where all these unwanted letters went. They couldn't get rid of them. They had to keep them. So when Polk became president, they sort of switched it around where you affix a stamp. The very first stamp ever issued was issued during Polk's presidency. You affixed a stamp and sent it on its way, paying it forward rather than backward. And I'm not sure if the postal system makes any more money now, but it's been certainly more effective. So he accomplished a great deal during his presidency. There's a great line. Somebody once asked Harry Truman who his favorite president was, and he said James K. Polk said what he wanted to do and did it. And that's very Truman-esque as well, sort of the same mentality. But again, successful president, left office, and then died 3 months later. So that legacy that so many presidents get in their retirement, Polk had no time to do it. Sarah, his wife, tried to do it for the next 42 years, a widow. She sort of became the curator of the Polk collection. She would open the doors to whomever wanted to come and hear. Every New Year's Day, she would entertain the Tennessee State Legislature as a body and hold a grand levee for them. She was sort of the grande dame of Nashville society for all of that time. She wore black for 42 years in honor of her husband. So incredibly devoted to him. They were an exceptional political couple.
It makes me think of Eliza Hamilton.
Yeah, I think that's right. Dolly Madison, another one. All of them were contemporaries. They were all living in Washington together. Polk spent 14 years in the United States House of Representatives. The last 4 of those as Speaker of the House. He's the only Speaker of the House to become president. Sarah, his wife, was by his side the entire time. They had no children. So instead of being a mother, she sort of immersed herself in her husband's political career and was very politically astute. There's a great quote from future President Franklin Pierce, who met her as a young congressman, who said, "I prefer to talk politics with Sarah Polk over anyone, including her husband." So she was very politically astute as well, going to Washington from the time she was in her early 20s. By the time she became First Lady, she had a very clear understanding of how politics worked, as did James K. Polk. If you get to read his diary, one of the things that struck me most is when you read his diary when he first became president, he was completely unintimidated by it. Having spent 14 years in the House, having been governor of Tennessee for a term, he absolutely understood what the presidency meant. And that's why he also knew that it translated to working 17 and 18 hours in a day. He had an agenda that he wanted to get done. He knew exactly what it took to do it.
Tom, I first realized the greatness of James K. Polk by reading Robert Mary's book, A Country of Vast Designs, which I highly recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about James K. Polk. One of the things that struck me about him was that he worked on Sundays. He worked many Sundays and was given a hard time at the time for working on Sundays when he was supposed to be resting. But my first question to you about Polk is that he wasn't supposed to be the presidential nominee for his party in 1844. One, Martin Van Buren was...
Oh, Bob's mad.
Martin Van Buren was the favorite going into the nomination process, and Polk was a bit of a dark horse.
He was the first dark horse president in American history. Yeah, in fact, he was in the lowest point in his political career. It's an incredible turn of events, and any number of things, a dozen things had to come into play in order for Polk to wind up with the nomination for the presidency in 1844. So he had spent 14 years in the House of Representatives, the last 4 as Speaker of the House, and then he gave up his seat to come back to Tennessee. If there was one thing that Andrew Jackson did, is he polarized the country, and his home state of Tennessee was no different. It was really shifting by the end of Jackson's presidency into Van Buren. Tennessee was shifting from being solidly Democratic to becoming a Whig state. So those were the 2 political parties in the time. You had the Democratic Party, you had the Whig Party, and Tennessee was splitting widely. So Polk gave up his seat willingly in the House of Representatives and came back to run for governor of Tennessee to sort of bring Tennessee back into the Democratic fold. He was elected one term and then lost 2 bids for re-election to a guy named Lean Jimmy Jones, or Slim Jim Jones, who is this great stump speaker, right? Where Polk was very lawyerly. All of his speeches are sort of point by point. Jimmy Jones was this great stump speaker who had anecdotes for every situation, kind of poked fun at James K. Polk. In fact, he'd use his name, Polk, by poking fun at him. So, and that's what Polk was up against, and he got beat solidly on 2 successive tries for governor. And then the election of 1844 comes. The Democratic Party was meeting in convention at Baltimore. And James K. Polk wasn't there. He wasn't a delegate. He was just practicing law here in Columbia. But he had a number of friends who were at the convention who started at first thinking, as everybody did, that Martin Van Buren, former president, who had had a pretty failed presidency, but was still very much the banner for the Democratic Party, everybody expected he'd get the nomination. Here's the amazing thing about James K. Polk. He writes this series of letters leading up to the convention, and he quarterbacks the whole thing. He says, I believe that they'll invoke the 2/3 rule. Everybody knows that Van Buren can get the majority. If they invoke the 2/3 rule, Van Buren's out. There's no way he can get 2/3. And then anybody with a name in the party has a shot. And that's exactly how it played out. Van Buren gets the majority, but he doesn't get 2/3. And all of a sudden, as each ballot comes about, his number starts dropping. And people like James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, Lewis Cass of Michigan, who are sort of bigger names in the party, their star starts to rise, but neither of them can get the 2/3 vote. But Polk has a couple friends working behind the scenes. People like Gideon Pillow, who is a lawyer here in Columbia, would go on to some infamy a little bit later. The great American historian George Bancroft working behind the scenes, and one of Polk's very few friends in his life, a man named Cave Johnson from Clarksville, Tennessee, a longtime congressman and senator from Tennessee, starts working behind the scenes. They go to the various delegations saying, what about James K. Polk as a compromise candidate? He's from Tennessee. He's from Jackson's backyard. He's not a big name in the party, but you'll not find a more partisan Democrat than Polk. He's somebody who we know where he stands. He's somebody that the party can coalesce behind. And so James K. Polk, on the 8th ballot, his name comes forward as a compromise, and on the 9th ballot, he got it unanimously.
And he kind of sat in the glow of Jackson. Wasn't he nicknamed at one point Young Hickory?
Young Hickory. They're trying to sort of create that persona. And this is an amazing time, too, for imagery, right? This is the first election where you start to see the lithograph coming into use and the daguerreotype, the earliest form of photography, coming into use no longer just to memorialize a sitting president, but to be used as a means to elect a person. So the very first campaign poster happens in this election of 1844. One of the great lithographic images shows James K. Polk dressed in his usual lawyer suit riding on a rearing white horse, right? So they're trying to create this persona around him. They're trying to make this lifetime lawyer and politician into this larger-than-life heroic figure a la Andrew Jackson, his political mentor. So, yeah, nicknames like Young Hickory sort of come into play as a means of getting Polk elected president. Remember, he's running against Henry Clay, one of the best-known politicians in American history.
The question that tripped up Van Buren and Henry Clay in 1844 was that of Texas. How did Polk let everyone know in his party that he was thinking the right way as far as bringing Texas into the Union?
Yeah, so we're talking about a time when there's no social media, right? There's no television, there's no instant coverage. The way that politicians promulgated information was through the newspapers, who are mainly partisan, right? Most of the newspapers were owned by the political parties. So it's an interesting turn of events. Van Buren and Clay, who were considered to be the two main contenders in 1844, both published letters within a day, I think, of each other, coming out against the immediate annexation of Texas. Clay especially believing that if Texas is annexed to the United States, it will probably lead to war with Mexico, a war that he thought would be unnecessary. He believed that Texas would probably become part of the United States just as a matter of course, that there was no need to push the effort that it would happen on its own. James K. Polk, just a few days later, published a letter coming out for the immediate annexation of Texas. It was James K. Polk that read the mood of the country rightly. This is a time in American history where the idea of manifest destiny is really gripping the nation, this idea that it's America's God-given right to extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and that's a notion that James K. Polk absolutely believed in. You know, he grew up on the Western frontier. He was a product of the Western frontier. He grew up with a father and grandfather who were land surveyors who were constantly wondering if there wasn't more prosperity over the next western hill. So by the time Polk is running for president and this idea is really gripping the nation, he's sort of the man for the time. He reads the mood of the country correctly, and he beats Henry Clay narrowly, just by a few thousand votes in that election.
And this is what strikes me as funny, is that Henry Clay is known as the Great Compromiser, and James K. Polk is the Great Compromise of the Democrat Party. So the Great Compromiser himself was defeated by the Compromise. What an interesting turn of events. So he goes in, so now you've got Polk's elected. He pushes for annexation and of Texas. He's also got the slogan 54-40 or fight. They want the whole Oregon territory. But this issue of Texas, they end up settling on Oregon, right? Because essentially Polk wants Texas. He's thinking like Jackson, who had wanted California. And the problem is, the Mexicans won't sell it to us. You know, they want to keep it. You know, like most people with their countries, they want to keep their country. And so now here we are. Polk wants to take this. They annex it in 44, December 44, correct? No, 45, December 45. They officially annex Texas, which, according to the Mexican government, was always a part of Mexico, right? Basically, the Texans catch Santa Anna, put him in a headlock, and make him say that it's theirs. Right. And then the Texas government says, no, it's not. He sends these troops in to Texas to basically say, once we've officially annexed Texas, we've essentially provoked a war with Mexico. Mexico recalls their delegates, recalls their ambassadors. And so Polk responds by sending our army, a good portion of our army, into Texas to the border. And Mexico doesn't attack, and they refuse to sell, so he pushed them further. And then there's this mysterious attack, right? This attack that later on Abraham Lincoln will, in the House of Representatives, say, if this attack really happened, you need to show us where it happened. I think Polk was spoiling for a fight. I think Polk wanted to take that land. And I think the Mexican-American War, which most people don't know about, is really problematic for our American narrative, because it really is a war where we want that land and we just take it.
Yeah, this is a period of American imperialism for sure.
Right. So what do you think? What's Polk's role in this? Because the day before this in a cabinet meeting, he says, I want to take Mexico. And his members of his cabinet say, you can't just take another country by attacking them. Like, that's not legitimate. And then the next day, suddenly there's this attack on our soldiers.
Yeah, this is absolutely the most controversial aspect of Polk's presidency. And as with everything Polk, he had a plan for making it happen. He wanted Texas, and I think you hit on it in that the border of Texas was the key point, right? What was the southern boundary of Texas? All right, so when Texas was part of Mexico, it was the Nueces River was the southern boundary of Texas. When Texas became independent, they declared it all the way to the Rio Grande. That's about a 150-mile area of disputed territory, both countries claiming it. So when Polk announces annexation of Texas, the Mexican minister goes home. They break off relations. Well, Polk tries, at least in his diary. He says he tries to open up negotiations by sending, and there's a very set form within the State Department how this happens, right? You send a lesser envoy typically to try to open up negotiations, and then when that happens, you send an ambassador who's clothed with the powers of the United States, a minister plenipotentiary, they're called. Polk skipped that first part. And he sent a guy named John Slidell, a man who was much hated in Mexico, clothed with the full powers of the United States. He wasn't going to get an audience, absolutely. So James K. Polk sees an opportunity here by sending an American force led by Zachary Taylor to defend the southern boundary of Texas. In his eyes, the Rio Grande. And it's not long before Mexico is going to do the same thing, sending a Mexican cavalry force up to the Nueces River, and it's not long before what he would say American blood shed on the American soil.
Right.
And that's the flashpoint of the Mexican War.
And then the war takes off, right? Because the battle happens very shortly thereafter. There are uprisings across, California and New Mexico. We seize the land there, and now we've occupied it, but Mexico will not acknowledge that it's ours. So we take this next step, which a lot of Americans don't know about. We go full on and invade Mexico and occupy Mexico City. What role did Polk play in making this decision to push into Mexico?
Yeah, when it became clear to him that the battles that were happening under Zachary Taylor's command in southern Texas and northern Mexico was not bringing Mexico to the treaty table, he sent a second-prong attack led by Winfield Scott, who landed at Veracruz, the very first amphibious assault in American history. And Scott, over the next several months, would follow the exact route that Cortez had used 300 years earlier from Veracruz until they captured Mexico City. It's an amazing thing. The Mexican-American Wars, people will say this about Korea, sometimes about Vietnam, sometimes about the Spanish-American War, but the Mexican War is truly a forgotten war. But it's critical to understanding American military history, certainly. This is the first war where you see the effects of West Point. So many of the young officer corps, the captains and lieutenants and even majors to a certain degree, had all been trained. So many of them had been trained at West Point. They were skilled in the art of war. They understood how to move troops. They understood how to feed troops. And here's the thing about Polk. He micromanaged everything from Washington in a war that's 2,000 miles away, where the telegraphic lines only stretched, as far as Richmond, Virginia. There was about a 2-week period between events happening on the battlefields to where he finds out. But he is running the show from Washington, D.C. He's appointing troops. He's signing his name to a huge number of documents. That goes back to that Herculean work ethic. He would stay up all night getting this work done. But he's absolutely micromanaging how this war is fought. And then Mexico City eventually falls under Winfield Scott. Mexico signed a treaty that gave up roughly half of their country. And so now when we look on an American map, everything from Texas to California comes in as a result of that war.
This is one of the things that amazes me. And on a lighter note, a lot of times I'll go out to California, and my wife's from Long Beach, and I'll see tourist groups come in generally from the South, from the Midwest, and you'll hear a lot of people speak Spanish in California, and you hear people say, "This is America. Why aren't these people speaking English?" And I always laugh because I'm like, yeah, why aren't people speaking English in Los Angeles? Right. Maybe you should go to San Diego or San Jose or San Francisco. They're all Spanish names for a reason. If you want an English name, go to Bakersfield. Nobody ever wants to take that suggestion, though. But it's like, it's amazing to me that we've forgotten this, because one part of it's just called New Mexico. Like, where do you think we got it from? Right. And it is clearly this annexation that takes place. My theory on this is because, I mean, there's this dual thing, right? Which on the one hand, yeah, I mean, people who are observing this war from the outside, the European observers, are like, this is a war machine. The young officers who show up at this time, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, these guys who are going to be trying to kill each other in 12 years, they're out there on the battlefield. They're amazing. So there's, on the one side, it's like, and this is the Marine Corps fight song, right? The halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Tripoli are the Barbary pirates under, when Jefferson's there, the president. The halls of Tripoli are this invasion of Mexico City, right? And no one, we often forget these things, but there's the triumph of that. But there's the other side, which is, this is just a clear case where we just straight up invade another country and take their land. That doesn't fit our narrative. We as Americans, we think we only go to war whenever we're attacked. We only do it for the right reasons. And my theory is that we ignore this war because that blows it all out of the water. And then if you start thinking about that, you're like, well, what about the Spanish-American War? What about World War I? What about Vietnam? What about all these other cases where actually the origins of all those things are a little bit shady if we look historically? Sure. So what do you think about this? Why is it that we've forgotten the Mexican-American War?
America has had its periods of imperialism, certainly. And as far as the Mexican War is concerned, it goes back to that idea of manifest destiny. You can't overstate the power behind that. This time period in American history, we talked about, if you look at just inventions that are having such an impact on people's everyday life, the telegraph, huge step in communication. When the Polks were living in the White House, they had it converted from candlelight to gas lighting for the first time. Huge impact on America. You see the rise of the railroad coming into being in this time period. Huge impact on transportation. All of these things are playing into what America sort of is becoming. There's this prevailing idea that there isn't anything that America can't accomplish. And this idea that there's always more prosperity over the next Western hill is an idea that's sort of pervading the nation and almost trumps this idea of imperialism. I mean, Polk can't wage a war by himself, right? He has to have the backing of Congress. He has to have the backing of the people, and he has it. So Polk often gets, the majority of the rap of the Mexican War, and I think that's appropriate. I think he should be vetted on this, certainly, but don't underestimate the power of American thought in this time period. People were willing to do it. And of course, it has a huge impact, right? I mean, the outcomes of the Mexican War are substantial. The biggest one, of course, is slavery. That with all of this territory coming in the Southwest, the question of slavery as a political issue really gains ground. What's the next question? Should slavery then extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean, or should it only remain in those states where it had existed prior to this? That debate continues through the 1850s. Of course, it's unfortunate Polk isn't there. He's dead 3 months after he leaves the White House. But all of those compromises through the 1850s that eventually fail and lead to civil war, politically speaking, the first shots of the war really happened at the end of Polk's presidency as a result of all of this land acquisition. 800,000 square miles of territory. It's about a third of the country comes in. It's the largest land acquisition in American history as a result of Polk's presidency.
One of the biggest slogans that came out of the Polk presidency was 54-40 or fight. Could you talk about that for our listeners? Explain what that boundary dispute with Britain in Oregon was all about?
Sure. All right. So there's two big components to land acquisition. You have the Mexican War that results in the acquisition of all the Southwest. But prior to that was the settlement of the boundary of the United States in the Pacific Northwest, what was then called Oregon Territory. That campaign slogan, 54-40, denotes that northernmost latitude all the way up at Alaska. America wanted it all. Polk wanted it all. Unfortunately for him, Great Britain owned a good portion of it as well. But there was no line of demarcation where the United States ended and British Canada began. So there is a lot of brinksmanship going on, right? Great Britain had this history of being sort of this blustery country. They weren't going to give in. James K. Polk, however, was almost as blustery. He wasn't willing to give in either. So they're threatening war, 54-40 or fight. I mean, that's a clear indication that the United States potentially is willing to go to war with Great Britain over all of this territory. But really through the negotiation power of James K. Polk, which also was considerable, through his Secretary of State, future President James Buchanan, they settled on what is now the northern boundary of the United States at the 49th parallel, Washington State.
Where does Polk fit in if we're going to rank presidents? I mean, when I read Mary's book, I was just like, I could not believe how much went down during his presidency. Where ultimately does he rank?
Typically, now historians have done rankings since the 1950s. Polk usually ranks in sort of that second tier of great presidents or near great presidents. You have a hard time finding another one-term president who managed to accomplish more than James K. Polk did. And so consistently he ranks quite high, although he's one of the least known presidents in American history just because he sort of gets lumped in between Jackson, this larger-than-life figure, and Lincoln, another larger-than-life figure. Polk was not a larger-than-life figure. He was a driven character, which made him successful. But historians rank him pretty consistently towards the top. I think the most recent C-SPAN ranking on President's Day 2017 put him at number 14. That's a two-space drop. President Obama actually went up to number 12. I think Monroe rose a few spots to 13. So Polk went from 12 to 14. So he's still ranked quite high among the presidents, higher than the other two Tennessee presidents. He and Jackson have always sort of gone neck and neck, but Jackson has taken a hit in recent rankings. I think he's 8 above Jackson and 20-something above Andrew Johnson, the other Tennessee president.
You know, I'd like to send out a message to our friends at C-SPAN or anyone who ranks presidents. Please do not rank any president who's been in office in the past 20 years. We need to give about 25, 30 years to really get a perspective on what they accomplished during their presidency. James K. Polk served one term, and he set out to serve only one term. What does it say about our political environment where no one would even consider that nowadays? You know, no one, like, that is service. When you say, I'm going to serve one term, work as hard as I can for my country, and then I'm going to step away and go home, no politician in the modern era would even consider that. What does it say about our current political environment that we don't have men like that seeking office?
I think politics has changed dramatically in the last 150 years. In the 19th century, you didn't go into politics expecting to make money. In fact, Polk lost a lot of money. He did well as an attorney, and jumping into politics, he only made $8 for every day that he served as a congressman. As governor of Tennessee, he made only $2,000 a year. You consider his very first year out as a young lawyer, 20-year-old lawyer, he made over $2,600 in his first year. I mean, being governor didn't pay. As president, he made $25,000 a year, which is a fair sum of money. So take the money out of the equation, right? That's not a thing, and it's probably not for most of the politicians in the 20th and 21st century either. I suppose so many of them are quite well off. But Polk, I think there's a certain level of principle in it, but there's also some political shrewdness. When he accepted the nomination in 1844, he knew his position was a difficult one, right? He wasn't a big name in the party. He was really nominated because he was one of the greatest Democrats. He was a very partisan politician, and he knew he had some competition with those other bigger named politicians. So by accepting the nomination in 1844 for a single term only, he was sort of consolidating his power. It would give somebody else a chance 4 years later. And so it's one of those things that coalesced the party behind James K. Polk in 1844. He was a very shrewd politician.
But do you think that decision was made easier for him to stand by? Because Teddy Roosevelt said the same thing when he accepted his first nomination, and then he ended up coming back in 1912. Do you think for Polk it was made easier by the fact that he was an incredibly divisive, controversial character at the end of his first term?
I think he was ready to be done, quite frankly, more than anything, especially if you look at the last half. Reading his diary in the last half of his presidency, he was really looking forward to retirement. I mean, think about what he accomplished and what that translated to in his day-to-day work life. I mean, it's incredible if you read his diary, read the correspondence, which is out, I think, in 13 volumes now. You get a sense of the man and really what it took. I mean, we have 2 portraits in our collection that show him 2.5 years apart, and he went in, a contemporary of his noted, he went in a vibrant young man and left an old man with a careworn face and locks vying in whiteness with the snow. I mean, there's a vast difference in how he looked physically, and of course he's dead 3 months later. It obviously had a big impact on him. So yeah, the presidency was really hard. I think he was looking forward to a potential retirement there.
Yeah, Tom showed us those pictures earlier, and it is a marked difference. And if you'd like to see the difference, you can come to Columbia, Tennessee, and check out this wonderful place here.
One last thing, if I can, at the end of his presidency, he was pressured to remain in office. There was a pretty large wing within the party who wanted to see him run again. By 1848, the party hadn't coalesced behind anybody any more than it had in 1844, and that was his hope, that by 1848 there was going to be a clear candidate. Lewis Cass ran on the Democratic ticket against Zachary Taylor, the hero of the Mexican War, one of the heroes of the Mexican War, certainly, and Taylor beat him pretty badly. So there were a lot of people urging Polk to remain in office, run for 4 more years. He'd win. He's had this successful presidency, and he wouldn't. He was a man of his word. He promised a single term, and he was sticking to it.
Well, Tom Price, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
And we like to recommend everyone come check out the Polk House down here in Columbia, Tennessee.
Thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Our program is produced by Bob Crawford, Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta. Edited by Bob Crawford and Ian Scotta. Paul DeFiglia provides our music. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and rate us on iTunes. For more information about this or any other episode, please visit theroadtonow.com. For Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.